In this video, we're going to learn all about basic chemistry that enhances our ability to understand biology. So, our main topics are the different properties of water, pH, and the elements necessary to make up life or living things. So, we begin with a basic question, something that you've probably all seen, especially if you've lived in Rochester, New York for any part of your life, is why does rain stick to windows? The answer is that the molecules in the water actually are attracted to the molecules in the glass. This is a property that water exhibits known as adhesion. You may have heard of something like adhesive tape, or you may have heard of glue called adhesive. It's the same idea. It just means that one thing is sticking to another. In this case, we're talking about water molecules, that they will stick to other surfaces. Second question, again, you've probably seen something like this, and if you haven't, there's an easy way to actually test it. But why does water make droplets? The answer to this is very similar to our first question, is that the molecules in the water are not only attracted to other molecules, but they're attracted to other water molecules. And this is a property known as cohesion. Okay, co just meaning together. So basically, it's just water molecules sticking to each other. Now, cohesion is actually responsible for another phenomenon, another property of water known as surface tension. Okay, you may have seen those little water strider bugs that kind of glide across the water, something like that. And they can actually stay on top of the water because the attractive force of the molecules kind of makes the top of the water like almost like a shield that they can stand on as long as they're not too heavy. Okay. Our next question is, how does adding Kool-Aid powder actually make Kool-Aid? Why doesn't it just sink to the bottom? And the answer is that the molecules of the water actually have a charge to them. The structure of the water molecule gives it a positive end and a negative end. This is known as polarity. Okay, so just like the Earth has a north and south pole, just like magnets have a north and south pole or a positive and negative pole, so do water molecules. There's a positive side and there's a negative side. And when they get together with another substance that is also polar, they will start to pull it apart, and the positives will hook onto the negatives and the negatives onto the positives, and it will disperse. Kool-Aid is a solution, and the two parts of the solution are the solute, which is the stuff that goes in this case, the Kool-Aid powder, and the solvent, the thing it's dissolving, which in this case is the water. Now, these are all great examples, but they really don't show anything about life yet. So we look at specific examples. So for instance, adhesion and cohesion are responsible for the ability of trees to actually absorb water. And water is actually going to be taken in through the roots and through something known as capillary action, which is a combination of adhesion and cohesion, is actually going to be drawn up through the tree into the leaves. That's why leaves can actually get the water from the roots. There's no sort of pump going on in the tree. It's just those properties. Without those properties of water, we couldn't have trees. Everything would have to be in constant contact with a source of water. Surface tension and cohesion, again, I explained, are responsible for some of those water skimmer bugs that glide across the surface of the water. Not crucial, but it does give a different environment or different abilities to those insects that they wouldn't have otherwise. And another one that's incredibly important for us is the polarity of water actually means things can dissolve in your blood. So your blood carries oxygen using red blood cells, but it carries a lot more than that. Things like nutrients and waste specifically. And if those were unable to dissolve in your blood, you couldn't carry those in your blood. So that's why polarity is important specifically to our bodies. Now, this is something that you may have heard of before, and even if you don't know it, you probably have heard of it. The formula for water. The formula for water is H2O, and that simply means that there's two hydrogen atoms attached to one oxygen atom, as we see in the diagram. Our hydrogen atoms have an overall positive charge, which lends to the idea that they are polar molecules. The oxygen atoms have an overall negative charge, again, adding to the polarity. But what happens if we take these water molecules and we start to split them up? Well, that's when we end up with acids and bases. If we take a look, acids are basically water molecules that have either added an additional H, an additional hydrogen, or it's simply when there's a free hydrogen available. Bases, on the other hand, are what we call hydroxide ions. It's a hydrogen and an oxygen, hence the term hydroxide. And they form bases in water. pH is a measure of this acid-base relationship. It simply measures the amount of H plus, the hydrogen ions, in the water. That goes into a little bit of a calculation, which we don't need to know, we won't go into right now, but that gives us acidity, and that's expressed as pH. Now there's a scale. pH is kind of belongs to a finite scale, and it goes from 0 to 14, 0 being your strongest acid, 14 being your strongest base. Right in the middle, at 7, is neutral. Neutral is pure water. Okay, so if we have the equal number of H pluses and OHs, and we put them together, that gives us H2O, pure water. So that's why we find pure water there as neutral. There are some other common things on the list. Stomach acid, everybody has it, is at about 2. Then you see Coke, Coca-Cola, and vinegar right there around 3.5, 2, okay, or 2.5. Those things are pretty acidic, guys. So that's one of those things you have to notice. Then we can also see that some organisms besides ourselves that are affected by this stuff. So you look in acidic environments, we see that at some point in time, fish actually die based on the amount of acid in the water. And that's a pretty substantial thing. And then we see rainwater there at about 5.5 to 6. Again, rainwater is not necessarily pure water. It does mix with a lot of stuff. And then towards the base side, or also known as alkaline side, we see we have baking soda, which you probably have in your house at around 8.5, and ammonia, which is actually a cleaner used in your house, is way down. It's very basic at a level 12. Now, the question is, why is pH important to us in biology? Well, one of the most important things that pH influences is the proteins in our bodies. Proteins are pH sensitive, which means they work best at a certain level of acid or base. If the pH changes too much, proteins can actually denature or melt. And once that happens, they don't work anymore. So you see how the problem would be there if we have a very strong acid or very strong base introduced into the human body. It's going to start breaking down all the proteins that you have. And you're not going to survive very well without those. Acid rain, kind of looking outside ourselves, acid rain actually changes pH of ecosystems. So beyond just individual organisms, we're talking about large areas. One of the most prominent examples of this is in the Adirondack Mountains, right here in New York State. The Adirondack Mountains were greatly affected by acid rain as a result of a lot of the manufacturing that went on in Michigan. It sounds kind of weird, but what happened is the air currents brought a lot of that pollution to New York State, and when it rained in the Adirondacks, that's where all the acid rain dropped, and it wiped out certain species that lived in the Adirondacks. So the Adirondack Mountains are very different from what they used to be 30, 40 years ago. Now, Acids aren't always going to stay acids because we can neutralize them. So when we take an acid and a base and we combine them, as long as they are in equal concentrations, we can end up basically with pure water with a little bit of salt left over. So if we take a look at the example here, if we have hydrochloric acid, which is a very strong acid, and we have sodium hydroxide, which is a very strong base, and we combine them together, they turn into water and table salt, stuff that you would sprinkle on your food. Now, individually, if you consumed either of those things, you'd end up with horrible burns, possibly even death. When you combine them, you basically have a glass of salty water. So that's one of those interesting components to this, is that when we have acids and bases, we can end up kind of canceling them out as long as we know how to do that. Now, beyond acids and bases, when we take a look at other elements, okay, I just mentioned hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide are made up of elements. So we have here the periodic table of elements, and we're going to focus primarily on 6 elements, ones that we see very, very frequently in living organisms, and we have them circled here: hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. We see them all the time in living things. The two probably most important to us are carbon and hydrogen. The reason that they're so important to us is that carbon and hydrogen have to be present in a molecule for that molecule to be considered organic. Okay? The basic structure of all of our molecules is based off of carbon. And the reason for that is carbon actually bonds the most time, which means you can stick the most other atoms onto a carbon atom. Hydrogens typically fill those spaces that are left when the carbon doesn't have something to bond with. So those two together are going to make organic molecules. Now, obviously, there's other things introduced to a lot of different other organic molecules, but carbon and hydrogen are the two that make something organic. They're absolutely necessary to have an organic compound. For example, if we have carbon dioxide, just carbon and oxygen, that's inorganic because there's no hydrogen in it. Okay? Other elements that are important are oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Now, oxygen is very, very common in organic molecules. Okay, behind carbon and hydrogen, oxygen is almost always going to be there, but not always. It's not required. It is, however, something that almost all organisms need to survive. Okay, oxygen, diatomically, O2 oxygen, is something that almost every single organism needs to survive. Strangely enough, if you add another oxygen and make it O3, that's actually ozone, which, if you've heard of the ozone layer, that's what the ozone layer is made of, is 3 oxygen atoms bonded together as ozone, and that protects from the sun's ultraviolet rays. Nitrogen is very important in specifically proteins and nucleic acids. It's necessary in the backbones of proteins. We find amino acids have to have a nitrogen in it to be formed. And pretty much all of your nucleic acids are also going to have nitrogen in it. It's one of the most abundant things in the atmosphere right now. Okay? It's about 70% of our atmosphere, the air you breathe in, is nitrogen. Now, I know that might sound strange because we think of, all right, we're breathing in oxygen, breathing out carbon dioxide. If we had much more oxygen in the air, small sparks would basically just ignite things. Okay? The fact that it's a lot of nitrogen in the air is actually very good for us. The other 2 elements we're looking at are phosphorus and sulfur, which again are very important for things like nucleic acids and proteins. Okay, their structure is just slightly different as atoms, and the way they bond is slightly different, which allows them to have different properties. So those 6 are going to be the most important atoms when we talk about living things. Now, so we can look at this and we can review. When we talk about organic and inorganic molecules, anything that has carbon and hydrogen is considered organic. Anything that is lacking one or both of those is going to be inorganic. So some common organic molecules that we'll see is glucose, which is C6H12O6, ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's an energy molecule in your body. Alanine, which is just an example of an amino acid that's used to make up proteins. And guanine, which is an example of a nitrogenous base that is used to make up DNA. All of those things are organic molecules. You notice in their formula that they all have carbon and hydrogen. Some common inorganic molecules we're going to see are oxygen, okay, just O2, doesn't have carbon or hydrogen. Carbon dioxide, which doesn't have any hydrogen in it. Water, which doesn't have any carbon in it. And salt, which doesn't have carbon or hydrogen in it. Those are all inorganic molecules. Even though humans produce carbon dioxide, it is still not organic based on its structure.